implicitly, the Tea Party embraces the idea of individual rights. The Tea Party, and it's on that banner back there, the Tea Parties had 3 core ideas. And I see this on the websites for all the Tea Parties. Those 3 ideas are fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. But underlying these ideas is the principle of individual rights. It's what unites all of these ideas. I'd say that the idea is implicit because I haven't heard the Tea Parties explicitly endorse the idea of individual rights, and that's what I would like to cover tonight, or at least address that issue. Individual rights have very broad implications, and I can't begin to address all those implications tonight. In fact, somebody should write a book, and oh, by the way, I did. So, like I said, I can't address all the implications. I'm just going to give some indications on how individual rights are actually applied and some of the implications of that. But if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to get a copy of my book. I address, I don't know, dozens of different issues, parks, education, energy, roads, and apply the principle of individual rights to all of these issues. I use historical and contemporary examples from both America, from Britain, India, France, from all over the world. So the point is that individual rights aren't confined to one time or one country. It's a universal principle. It's applicable to all individuals in all times. So enough about my book. So let's look at two of the core ideas of the Tea Parties. I want to look at free markets and limited government and examine how the idea of individual rights applies to these 2 core ideas. And we'll look first at one reason I'm not going to discuss fiscal responsibility is I don't regard that as important. I think if we actually had free markets and limited government, the fiscal responsibility would take care of itself. So I'm not going to address that because time's limited. So let's first look at free markets. We hear lots of people talk about free markets. I think Obama's even said he's in favor of free markets at one time or another.
Obama lies a lot.
Well, that's true, but the point is that seemingly everybody says they're in favor of free markets. But what does that mean? Fine, everybody's in favor of free markets, but what's a free market? Well, Margaret Thatcher once said that the operative word in free market is free, and she's right. And as I mentioned earlier, freedom means the absence of coercion. So a free market is a marketplace in which there is no coercion, in which individuals are free to produce and trade according to their own judgment, without any restrictions, without any controls, without any coercion on the part of government. Now you might think that might sound like I'm saying get rid of all regulations, and that's exactly what I'm saying. In a free market, there are absolutely no government regulations of economics. None. Zero. Zip. Nada. I can't be any more clear. The SEC goes away. The FDA goes away. The FAA. The IRS. No government regulatory agencies. Now why? Why does the principle of individual rights require that? Well, what do regulations do? What do all these government regulatory agencies do? They tell us how to live our lives. They say, you must act this way, or you can't act this way. But they initiate force against us. They tell us what we can and cannot do. They prevent us from acting according to our own judgments and living our lives as we choose to live them. They prevent us from pursuing our happiness. They violate all of our rights. Well, let's look at one example. Let's look at one regulatory agency and see how this plays out. And I deliberately picked a regulatory agency that you might think is somewhat justified. This has got some reasonable justification for existing. That agency is the Food and Drug Administration. Does anybody think that we should have an FDA?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll see if I can change your mind. The stated purpose of the FDA is to ensure that we have a safe food supply and to make sure that the drugs put out by the pharmaceutical companies are safe and effective. Now that seems like a pretty reasonable goal. I mean, who wants to eat tainted food? Who wants to take drugs that are toxic and you think they're saving your life, but they're actually killing you? So the FDA seems, of all the government regulatory agencies, that might seem like one that's pretty reasonable. There's a lot more to the story than that. For example, Abigail Burroughs was 19 years old when she was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. And her doctor found this a drug that he thought showed some promise for treating her disease. Unfortunately, the FDA hadn't approved that particular drug to treat her disease. But Abigail contacted the FDA and said, may I please take this drug? And they said no. And so Abigail and her family said, may I pretty please take this drug? And they spent 8 or 7 months battling with the FDA, begging for permission for her to take this drug that might perhaps save her life. Well, she died in 7 months, so their battle ended. Now, sadly, 5 years later, the FDA got around to approving that drug for her particular type of cancer. But obviously, it was too late for Abigail. So what does this tell us? I said that there's more to the story. Well, the FDA was acting on a certain premise. The FDA was acting on the premise that Abigail's life did not belong to her, that she wasn't free to choose how to live her life. She wasn't free to act on her own judgment. Here, she had this life-threatening disease. She judged that, in consultation with her doctor and her family, she judged that this particular medicine had some hope for her, that it might save her life. And she was willing to take whatever risks were associated with this drug. It was her choice, it was her life. According to the Declaration of Independence, it's her life, and she should have the liberty to live it as she chooses. But according to the FDA, her life belongs to the government. She shouldn't be free and have the liberty to act according to her judgment. And that's the premise of every single regulation. That your life belongs to the government, not to yourself. Every single regulation is based on the premise that you can only act as government officials, government bureaucrats, and politicians determine appropriate. Not as you choose, as they say is okay. You can't act by right, but only by permission. Every single government regulation violates our rights as individuals. They prevent us from living our lives as we choose. Now, you probably think that if we got rid of all the regulatory agencies, life would be chaos. There'd be unscrupulous businesses, putting dangerous products on the market, taking advantage of consumers. How in the world would we protect ourselves, from the Bernie Madoffs of the world? We need some regulations to take care of those people. I'd say you're wrong. We don't need government regulations. And again, there are examples of this in my book, but I'll give you a few examples right now. Has anyone here ever used Angie's List or the Better Business Bureau to say find a doctor or a contractor or just check out some business? Has anybody ever used these? Okay, looks like maybe half the people.